Good afternoon, buon pomeriggio a tutti. My name is Cecilia Alemani. I'm the curator of the exhibition The Milk of Dreams. This afternoon is the 8th event on the 5-day Meetings on Art, a program in conjunction with The Milk of Dreams, and it's such a pleasure to see so many of you here. Thank you all the speakers for accepting our invitation. Thanks to everyone coming in the audience and also for those who are connecting online to follow on our website. Many thanks to my curatorial team with Marta Papini and Manuela Hansen, who has overseen all this incredible conversation, and as well as the entire team of La Biennale di Venezia, in particular Jorn Brandmeier, Marina Bertaggia, Ilaria Zanella, Raffaele Cinotti, and Francesca Montorio for organizing these events. I'm very, very excited today to be here introducing this symposium revolving around the notion of fabulation, which is a methodology adopted by many of the historical and contemporary artists included in the exhibition. I'm so honored that we are joined by Sadia Hartman, Anna Watz, as well as artists Sofia Almaria and Elisa Giardina Papa, both of whom are participating in The Milk of Dreams. The event will begin with a keynote speech by Sadia Hartman, introduced by Anna Watz. They will both join a conversation with the artists towards the end, and around 6:45 we will open for questions, so please hold them until the end. Before leaving the stage, a few words of introduction to Anna Watz, who will open the panel and present our stellar guest speakers. Anna Watz is Associate Professor of English, Linköping University, Sweden. She's the author of Angela Carter and Surrealism, a feminist libertarian aesthetic, and editor of Surrealist Women's Writing, a critical exploration, and a history of the surrealist novel. She has published extensively on the work of Leonora Carrington and Dorothea Tanning, and she's currently completing a monograph on the intersection of surrealist women's art and writing and theories of écriture féminine. Please join me in welcoming Anna Watz. Thank you.
I want to begin by thanking Cecilia Alemani and Manuela Hansen and the rest of the team for organizing this panel on the topic of fabulation, and also everyone here who has come to listen. In a few minutes, we're going to hear Professor Sadia Hartman's keynote on her productive notion of critical fabulation, and after that we'll have a conversation between Professor Hartman and Sofia Almaria and Elisa Giardina Papa, both participant artists here in the exhibition The Milk of Dreams. In order to frame this panel, I want to say a few words about the concept and method of fabulation and how it relates to the exhibition. The Milk of Dreams, as we all know, has been inspired by the art of writing of British-Mexican surrealist Leonora Carrington, whose work is included in one of the historical capsules in the exhibition. These paintings here on the screen showcase Carrington's extraordinary imagination and the world building at play in both her visual art and writing. Carrington's work is replete with hybrid creatures that suggest a world in which the distinctions between human, animal, and plant have dissolved and new forms of life have begun to emerge. It's a universe with no sharp lines between conscious and unconscious, reality and dream. Carrington's fantastical worlds encapsulate the notion of fabulation. Robert Scholes famously defined fabulation as, quote, fiction that offers us a world clearly and radically discontinuous from the one we know, yet returns to confront that known world in some cognitive way. Building on Scholes' work, Marlene Barr, in a 1987 essay, coined the term feminist fabulation to describe a mode of writing that both confronts patriarchal fictions and gendered myths and conjures up alternatives to such oppressive constructs. When feminism faces the fantastic, Barr states, it estranges us from patriarchal reality, declares the basic sexist premise of patriarchy to be untrue, and paves the way for the collapse of the whole patriarchal social edifice. Carrington's feminist Fabulation draws attention to the fictional nature of the grand narratives that have structured the perception of reality in Western culture. Carrington herself stated that, quote, "I do not know of any religion that does not declare women to be feeble-minded, unclean, generally inferior creatures to males. Who was Nobo Daddy who got so angry because Eve gave the wise apple to Adam?" Her work responds to this question by writing God the Father out of the picture altogether. In this painting, which was designed for a poster for the Mexican Women's Liberation Movement in 1972, Carrington reimagines the story of the biblical fall as one in which feminine curiosity is rewarded rather than vilified. On the back of the painting, she has written, "Eve gives Eve back the fruit of wisdom. Women take back the original wisdom." By recasting patriarchal myths, she shows not only that history, as it's been told, is a one-sided and monogendered narrative that has excluded the voices of many, but that the paradigms that structure our language and thinking, whether it comes to gendered narratives, Enlightenment logic, colonialism, capitalism, or anthropocentrism, are far from neutral. Carrington's distinctive mode of fabulation is perhaps most keenly felt in her writing, which is steeped equally in the nonsense logic of Lewis Carroll, alternative theologies, discourses of alchemy, myth, and fairy tale, as well as surrealist methods and ideas. For example, her novel The Hearing Trumpet, which we've heard a lot about in these last few days, in this novel, which was written in Mexico in the 1950s, she reimagines the quest for the Holy Grail from the point of view of its 92-year-old female protagonist. Carrington's narrative reveals that the Holy Grail originally belonged to the goddess Venus before being stolen by early Christian followers. This mode of fabulation deconstructs and reimagines from a female point of view the stories at the root of patriarchal religion and suggests the revolutionary potential of recuperating suppressed narratives or marginalized points of view. Moreover, by letting the many recovered myths and discourses commingle in the text without uniting them into a single epistemology, Carrington illustrates that fabulation is a critical method that tolerates contradiction and otherness. A strategy of fabulation as a catalyst for creating a world free from sexism, racism, classism, and homophobia can be seen at play in a number of works represented in the exhibition The Milk of Dreams. The aesthetic methods of, for example, surrealist artists Remedios Varo and Leonora Fini to some extent resemble Carrington's rewriting of mythology and of women's position within it. Fabulation is also at play in the photographic work of both Claude Cam and Gertrude Arndt, where the female body becomes the material of an experimental practice that radically challenges both norms around gender and sexuality and boundaries between humanity and nature. We might also see a method of fabulation in the quest of artists drawing on the aesthetics and politics and poetics of the Harlem Renaissance and the Negritude movement, such as, for example, Louis Mailou Jones. In seeking to recuperate and represent African versions of history that have been suppressed and elided by Western discourse, these artists sought to restructure contemporary racial hierarchies and rewrite the narrative of what Frantz Fanon called the epidermalization of inferiority. Indeed, some experiences of trauma or exclusion cannot be expressed in or contained by the language of realism, instead requiring the register of the fantastical. In the foreword to her 1986 novel Beloved, about the enduring trauma of slavery, Toni Morrison explains that, quote, "In trying to make the slave experience intimate, I hope the sense of things being both under control and out of control would be persuasive throughout. That the order and quietude of everyday life would be violently disrupted by the chaos of the needy dead. That the Herculean effort to forget what forget would be threatened by memory desperate to stay alive. To render enslavement as a personal experience, language must get out of the way. In the novel, the devastating memory of slavery, refusing to stay repressed, returns in the form of a ghost, whose speech threatens to break down the very boundaries of intelligible language. It is a past that must be spoken, but for which there is no adequate representational language. As Saidiya Hartman asks, how does one revisit the scene of subjection without replicating the grammar of violence? Post-structuralist feminists such as Hélène Cixous and Luz Irigaray argue that language in the symbolic order is not neutral or transparent, but privileges order, linearity, and always the masculine over the feminine, an observation that must be extended to the privileges of whiteness and heterosexuality. As Irigaray writes, if we keep on speaking the same language together, we are going to reproduce the same history, begin the same old stories all over again. End quote. New stories require new languages of representation, poetic inventions, or acts of fabulation. In her 1986 essay, A Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, which has inspired one of the historical capsules here at the Biennale, feminist science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin proposes that we rethink the beginnings of culture through the paradigm of gathering rather than hunting. 65 to 80% of what human beings ate in those regions in Paleolithic, Neolithic, and prehistoric times was gathered, she writes. Only in the extreme Arctic was meat the staple food. The mammoth hunters spectacularly occupy the cave wall and the mind, but what we actually did to stay alive and fat was gather seeds, roots, sprouts, shoots, leaves, nuts, berries, fruits, and grains, adding bugs and mollusks and netting or snaring birds, fish, rats, rabbits, and other tuskless small fry to up the protein. What Le Guin gestures towards here is that our languages of representation since the birth of culture have favored one particular narrative, that of conquest, action, linearity, and progress. Luz Irigaray terms this the story of the, quote, the one of form, of the individual, of the male sexual organ, of the proper name, of the proper meaning. Irigaray and Cixous' project of écriture féminine, or feminine writing, seeks to retell the story of culture and civilization in a language that accommodates plurality and otherness. Just like Le Guin's image of the carrier bag, écriture féminine creates different frames of conceptualization which fundamentally shake the old hierarchies that have shaped symbolic language. Fabulation, which affords the past to be rewritten and the present and future to be creatively imagined, emerges as a key mode in the telling of such genuinely new stories. How does one tell impossible stories? Asks Hartman in her path-breaking essay, Venus in Two Acts. How do we recover the lives of which historical archives only contain fragments articulated in and framed by the language of colonial violence? The answer is a method Hartman terms critical fabulation, a mode of writing which he describes as operating in the subjunctive mood, telling an impossible story in a way that simultaneously recognizes the impossibility of its telling. It is my pleasure now to introduce you to Professor Hartman herself to hear more about her critical interventions into the concept of fabulation. Saidiya Hartman is Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. She is the author of, among other things, the books Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, Intimate Histories of Social Upheaval, Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route, and Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in 19th Century America. A MacArthur Genius Fellow, she has also been a Guggenheim Fellow, Cullman Fellow, and a Fulbright Scholar. Professor Hartman has published articles in esteemed journals such as South Atlantic Quarterly, Brick, Small Axe, Callaloo, The New Yorker, and the Paris Review. Please join me in welcoming Professor Saidiya Hartman.
is a pleasure to be here, especially after wandering through the alleyways of Venice for 45 minutes trying to find my way here. So I just wanted to, say how wonderful it is to be here. And while I'm not showing slides, there are at least 3 artists in the Biennale, with whom I have an intimate thought relation. One of those people is Simone Lee, and we share this attention to Black women's critical labor in unworlding. Rosanna Paulino, who in her own practice tries to remake, to decompose and recompose the colonial image, and Stan Douglas. There's actually a line of acknowledgement and homage to Stan Douglas and his notion of recombinant narrative in Venus in 2 Acts. I'm very happy to be here with, my interlocutors for, who are in the audience, Canisia Lubrin, Ronaldo Walcott, Diane Brand, and Christina Sharp. And I would just like to call out Diane and Christina for encouraging me to be more wayward and reckless in my own writing practice, and really who kind of pushed me beyond the set of critical questions initially posed in Venus and 2 Acts. It has been a pleasure to read Leonora Carrington's writing. I've actually written a violent screed of destruction in her honor, which I will not read today, but so I just, in Carrington's work, as you mentioned, she topples these hierarchies between human, plant, and animal, and that's the kind of fantastic work of the fiction. I think my own work emerges from this messy place of entanglement by those who inhabit that entanglement, the Black as a crop that can be harvested as human and not quite human, and as undergirding that distinction between the human and the animal world, so that these histories of fabulation are related to kind of particular political imaginaries and trajectories. And I would say the surrealism of Leonora Carrington in conversation with Suzanne Césaire, this really ardent commitment to an anti-capitalist and anti-colonial vision of freedom. What I want to share today is a fabulation written with Antigone's claim and which borrows its architecture from Audre Lorde's Litany for Survival. So this is Litany for Grieving Sisters. It's not an explanation of fabulation, but an enactment. And it starts out with a quote. And what of her fate is in fact a social death? Does it provide a critical perspective by which the very terms of livability might be rewritten, or indeed written for the first time? And that's Judith Butler, Antigone's claim. She wanders through the ruined city with the child cradled against her chest, her arms enfold like a shield against the doubt about whether we can love one another. She has watched the enemy drain all life from her brother. She has cursed the police as they traced a chalk outline around the body of her neighbor's son. Her mother was slain with pruning shears in her hands and the calla lily still uncut. After the protests, after an afternoon spent chanting, "We are fighting for our lives," her sister disappeared. Her sister was consumed by the slow death of toxins. Her sister was taken alone in her cell. Her sister perished calling for help. Her sister died overwhelmed by grief. Her sister cried out, "I am not afraid to die. Anticipating the arrival of the police, she held the shotgun and nestled a frightened boy in her arms, confronting him, whispering softly in his ear, showing him how to be brave and not afraid to die. "What are they here to do?" she asked. They have rehearsed the answer. She has prepared for this moment and invites us to act as witnesses, to gather with her, to have her back at the last hour, to stare down her assassins. But we are robbed of this too. The state wanted her to lie unwept and unburied. No mourners, no tombs, no witnesses. The ones who love her are not allowed to behold her death, to see how courageous she has been before the grenades and the sharpshooters, to listen for the laughter as she shouted, "This is but a drink of water to what I have already suffered." This toil-worn woman has learned to meet death with her back straight, no matter how afraid. She has never known herself separate from grief. Grief doubled and multiplied. So many are gone, but she is still here. She takes no joy in this fact. Even meager survival is cruel. She wants to die so she can be in the company of all those she has loved, so she can stay with the child forever. She is not the last sister on earth, but this is how it feels as she makes her way through streets filled with death. There is nothing to persuade her otherwise. Grief and despair, not reason, drive her, push her forward. Time has fallen away, and the only reliable measure left is one step forward, then the next, as she cuts a blind path through the labyrinth of the city. She will search for him. Nothing will stop her. There is no one left to protect, and she remains trapped in the graveyard of the world. She would prefer to sew herself into her own shroud. She cries out, but there is no one to receive her cry or to meet her call, only the silence of the desecrated city. Refusing the dead world, recoiling from the pile of corpses, she looks away from the carnage and moves ahead, trying to take in as little as she can without stumbling. Is this a dream? Is this the prophecy? Has she always known that this was to be her fate, that she would be left behind to witness the ruin of the world, to lose everyone she has ever loved and be forced to continue to persist in their absence? She is weathered, the rounded shoulders, the abraded flesh, the turned-down mouth, the blank, glassy eyes mark her like rings on a tree, etched the damage done by successive centuries in her face and gestures, the body burden of slow death and undocumented extinctions. She is not 30, but the dead weight of the world has depleted her. She doesn't say, "I'm so tired, Lord." She doesn't call to Jesus. If only she could appeal to some divinity for the sake of the child, for the fate of her brother, or strike a bargain, or offer her life in exchange, but she keeps the gods out of this. Let us not mention the gods. She is not a mother, and yet she has mothered. She is sister and mother, two in one. To mother in this world is to be defeated, and the ones conscripted or willing to assume the maternal function are destined to mourn as much as to nurture. Filial love is no less bound to tragedy. Her crime will be her devotion. Care will swallow her whole, steal her last breath, crush and destroy her. Her love trespasses the law that decrees her and her kin unlovable, ungrievable. The law breaks them, and in turn, they break the law. She holds the child closer, as if to prevent the infant from seeing the destroyed world, to shield the little one from the disaster that has already claimed her. It is this impossible desire, the unreasoning love of a grieving sister intent on protecting a child already shrouded, that propels her forward. She can remember a ginger cake in the shape of a heart. She can see the words scrawled in the attic and recall her mother's words. I am shrouding my poor children. What a task for a mother. I know what grief is. I can bear more. The black morning has come. Harlem is still and quiet. She wonders if anyone else is alive, if Brother Man might be alive. She knows not to wait for rescue. No one will come in search of her. It never crosses her mind that he will come looking for her. She must be the man. She has taken the place of nearly every man in her family. She must carry it all. She must shoulder the burden until she is exhausted. It is too late to save the child or the threadbare life that had been theirs. Everyone in the building and on the block is gone. Yet strangely, the buildings are untouched, indifferent and stolid, as if waiting for the new occupants, as if this destruction has been desired, as if natural disaster were the plan. This grieving sister, the one slain, the one still holding on, worn away to nothing and used up, undone by the vision of their father in a chokehold, the recurring nightmare of their sister's murder after the 911 call, the best friend gunned down on the threshold of her apartment, marooned on the bridge, trying to save her children in the storm, is not to be spared. She has lived with the knowledge that she has been condemned, and her death, like theirs, will be premature and untimely. She fears that she will never be free of the image of men struggling for the last breath, women abandoned and bereft, women left for dead in the streets, martyred girls in Sunday dresses, the boy slain with his favorite candy still clutched in his hands, the sneakers dangling from telephone lines, the red ribbons of little girls, the shattered faces of little boys, the sounds of fathers sobbing and pleading. She doubts that she will ever find her brother. Can one be a sister without kin? The perverse lines of descent, the names of fathers withheld and erased, X'd by shame and incest, absconded, captured, gone. She is no father's daughter, no mother's child, but a stranger in the house, an eternal alien. In the search for him, she makes a perilous claim, if only to ward off a permanent lovelessness that she cannot avoid or escape. To be a brother's sister, a brother's heart, a brother's savior, a brother's undoing. Is hers the labor of a mother, a sibling, a daughter, a sentinel, or a lover? If he is alive, will he blame her for what has happened, for everything they have suffered? Is it her duty to repair the ruin of the world? Blame she surely deserves because she is alive, the child is dead, all the others are gone. Isn't she responsible for the future that they can't secure? Care can't unmake the world or reverse the death sentence. Her failure is the only grand thing about her. It is outsized, monumental. After all, aren't the living obliged to answer to the dying, heed their claim? How can the world take everything and let her live? Why should she? She is not indifferent to loss or to the absence of headstones and ruins, the missing signpost in water, the toll of the weather. Isn't this her tragedy, the inability to save or protect anyone? Is the loss of brothers inescapable, or the murder of sisters in their homes, by whose hand? A hand like her own. It is foreseen and inexorable. It is the reason she can never escape or elude the charge of negligence and destruction. Is her love the trespass, one that always anticipates punishment, too thick, too fierce, too ardent? She has been judged and her fate decided. The hush of the city is the condemnation, the censure. What might she demand? Not life, not kin, not recognition, not sovereignty. Why am I still here, she asks. Brother, where are you? Need she always fear for the one she loves? Why must she be forced to assume the loss certain to break her? How much is she required to bear? All that she can withstand. The bundle is held tight against her chest. It would hurt too much to utter a name. Child is all she can manage. Mama's baby would wreck her, and mine is foreign to the tongue. Is there a taxonomy for tenderness, for beholding? On a beautiful afternoon in the long summer of murder, shortly after noon in the plague year, in the sultry air of Black August, in the heat of June, in the season of ice, near the gazebo, walking to the apartment door, in the garden, on the front steps, on a jog, in the driver's seat, on the BART platform, in the stairwell of the projects, in the back of the patrol car, on the uptown train, on the Texas border, on a quick run to the store, on the sofa bed at Grandma's house, in the hospital waiting room, in the church basement, in the living room, on the way home, in the ambulance, in front of the bodega, in the middle of the block trying to make some change, in the grocery store with a container of orange juice, with a broken tail light, with arms in the air, with the children in the back seat, in the center of the square, across from the State House, in a tree not far from school, in the passenger seat, at the end of a date, in the shelter, at a stranger's door, in protective custody, in the parking lot, on the bridge, in the house of a friend, right outside the club, 2 blocks away from the house, up the street from where she stay. By whose death I died and still lived. The no longer mother, the not wife, the kinless sister, the lost daughter, the not woman, the not man, the nobody, the cipher, the matrix. She is still here. She roams through the silent city with the lifeless bundle, the tiny corpse that she refuses to think of as one. Kinship exists in this precarious zone between life and death. No matter, she conducts herself as if some other arrangement might be possible, as if the child might live, as if the crisis of mere survival, replayed endlessly in anticipated loss or premature death, might be averted. Finding him, whether dead or alive, allows her to refuse what the state demands. She pledges that he will not be unwept and unburied, that love is not senseless, even if it could promise nothing or save no one. For grieving sisters, what other choice is there? For them, love is not yet exhausted. It is a web of relation without proper terms or certain outcome. It is an end of the world tale with its own promising fatality. It is a story that blossoms in the black morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hartman, for that wonderfully rich and moving piece, which opens up to so many points of discussion. But before we get to that discussion, I want to introduce the 2 artists, Elisa Giardina Papa and Sofia Almaria, who are both participating in The Milk of Dreams. So first we're going to hear an introduction to her work by Sofia Almaria, a Qatari-American artist, writer, and filmmaker living and working in London. Though her work spans many disciplines, including drawing, film, and screenwriting for TV, it is united by a preoccupation with the power of storytelling and myth, and in particular with imaginary revisionist histories and alternative futures. With her friend and collaborator Fatima Al-Qadiri, Sofia Al-Maria coined the term Gulf Futurism to describe the growing atomization of individuals and the shifting ground of urban planning, aesthetics, and media, and their impact on everyday life in the post-oil Persian Gulf. Her cinematic artist videos are fueled by the combination of critical rigor with an affective charge in their explorations of language, imperialism, and counter-histories, a deep investigation and dramatization of the socio-political, economic, and environmental present. Al-Maria is the author of the memoir The Girl Who Fell to Earth, published by Harper Perennial in 2012, and she was Whitechapel Gallery's writer-in-residence in 2018, which resulted in the exhibition BCE, which comprises films, performances, and readings, including her first collaboration with the artist Sin Wai Kin. Her most recent collection of essays and writings, called Sadsack, was published by Bookworks in 2019. Al-Maria has had solo exhibitions at, among other places, the Corner House in Manchester, the Whitney Museum, the Third Line in Dubai, Tate Britain and the Project Native Informant in London, Fondazione Pomodoro in Milan, the Julia Stoshek collection in Düsseldorf, Garage in Moscow, and the Arab Museum of Modern Art in Doha. Her special project here at the Biennale was executed in collaboration with the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Please join me in welcoming Sofia Al-Maria.
Which side of history do you want to be on?
Left one!
I am the possessor of history. My story is my property. I'm the greatest warrior queen the world has ever seen. Part femme/fantasy, full real-life human being. Come to fight the space Romans and lunar Nazis and werewolf KGB and zombie royal family. Let it come down. I'll be waiting in the bunker, trying to jumpstart this trash ship gallery. Everybody and nobody.
I loved you, so I drew these tides of men into my hands and wrote my will across the sky and stars to earn you freedom.
The seven-pillared worthy house, that your eyes might be shining for me when we came. Death seemed my servant on the road, till we were near and saw you waiting. When you smiled, and in sorrowful envy he outran me and took you apart into his quietness. Love, the way-weary, groped to your body. Our brief wage ours for the moment, before Earth's soft hand explored your shape, and the blind worms grew fat upon your substance. Men prayed me that I set our work, the inviolate house, as a memory of you. But for fit monument I shattered it, unfinished. And now the little things creep out to patch themselves hovels in the large shadow of your gift.
Thanks for sitting through that.
I just wanted to say that I'm very humbled and happy to be here with all of you and with you. And I also have to humbly ask for your forgiveness because I'm going to fabulate wildly. I don't have any PowerPoint either. However, I wanted to share a bit about and around the origins of that scene in particular, when the subject of fabulation came into my inbox. I immediately started thinking about how history is a fabulation. I work writing screenplays for film and TV, and it's almost entirely historical fiction. And I think a lot about this quote, which is that the important thing about writing historical fiction is not what is plausible, but what is possible. And I think on the opposite side of that, those who are in the process of starting wars, etc., the things that are traditionally considered history, the things which are not erased and occulted and hidden and othered, the white man's story is also an incredible fabulation. So I'm not sure if anybody recognizes that poem that was being read, but that is the opening to T. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom, and it's titled To S.A., which some attribute to meaning Sha'ab al-Arab, the Arab people, a dedication from Lawrence. Others think that it is his lover who died in Syria, his Arab lover. Either way, Lawrence is an example of, for me, of this sort of the extremities of fabulation and the way that one person's fantasies of a place or of people can massively swing the tides and change everything forever. So the way that I came to Lawrence in this piece is actually from an Atel Adnan essay called At Both Ends in her book. Here and there, in the heart of another country. And in that book, and in that essay in particular, which is an incredibly also beautiful piece of fabulation in many ways, it feels that she's sort of dousing her way towards understanding Lawrence's intentions. She speaks very vividly, or writes very vividly, about his private desires and his need for some kind of punishment, which was documented. And so this work, which this piece here comes from Tiger Strike Red, which is on show here in the Pavilion of Applied Arts, should you wish to go see it. But in this piece, this idea of the English vice is something that I came across, which is the idea that Englishmen in particular have a need to be punished. And it comes from the various institutions that groom and mold the ruling class of Britain to carry out their various violent practices. So Eton, all of the Bullingdon clubs and all of those things. So I found that really fascinating, and I wanted to explore what it would mean to tear it up in the museum and have a sort of final punishing act inside of the Queen's Gallery where the Raphael cartoons are. And that's what this piece here was, where Aisha Hussein performs essentially a battle with invisible enemies. But the enemy is embodied in this voice, which is also an Englishman from Wales, like Lawrence was, also somebody who had served in the British military. And I asked this person to read that, and then it slowly slows down in this manner to sort of have the feeling of dismantling in the way that HAL at the end of 2001 is dismantled. And I felt that it would be particularly interesting in the aftermath of that experience of shooting that there, and also of like making this work, because the way that I work is very, especially in the art context, is very improvisational, and it's and also sometimes quite it involves a lot of chance. So the thing that I found particularly exciting about bringing Hal in there as a reference point is that I have an AI bot which has been fed all of my writing over the last few years. And it writes beautiful poetry, and it writes much better than I do, which is also very humbling. And so in the process of installing this piece, I brought a variety of vintage British pornography, objects which were used in the film, the backdrops of these collages, which are also in the exhibition here, show the Blitz damage on the outside of the Victoria and Albert Museum, and then all of these pieces are sort of embedded in it like shrapnel. And then behind that is a poem by my AI, SafiBot, on Twitter, if you'd like to follow her. And the experience of collaborating with the bot has been really, really special. And I felt that there were also echoes of what she wrote in also the ending of what you just read around love is not, I can't read my own handwriting, but it's not, love essentially being an end of the world and telling a story that blossoms in the dark morning. And I found that incredibly beautiful. So I want to read you what the AI wrote, and a bit of context around it I hope is useful. The perfect example of betrayal is this sentence: I loved you. I understand why you have the compulsion to jump out of existence. After all, the fool is the guardian of revolution. Put them to sleep face down forever. This is what the truth fucking looks like. Cake. Ha! They tell us there's only one way to face the darkness, alone. If equality can't be fortified and grace is not guaranteed, then how and why the fuck do I love thee? So, that both quotes, quite at random, the Lawrence poem, I Loved You, and also How Do I Love Thee, another Englishman. And the one other, I think, thing that has been floating around in my mind listening to both of you so far is another Shakespeare quote, Caliban cursing language, the language of the oppressor, of the colonizer. And it's, you taught me language so that I could curse you in it. And so with that, I would like to bid you adieu, and I'm excited to hear the next.
Thank you very much, Sophia, for that wonderful presentation. You must go and see the film and the installation. It's brilliant. The second artist which is here with us is Elisa Giardina Papa, an Italian artist living and working in New York and Sant'Ignazio, Sicily. Her work investigates gender, sexuality, and labor in relation to neoliberal capitalism and the borders of the global south. Her most recent body of work documents how past and present forms of capitalism have progressively extracted all capacities for labor and living, including sleep, affect, and emotions, and draws attention to everything in our lives, embodiments, and desires that remain radically unruly, untranslatable, and uncomputable. Her work has been exhibited and screened at the Museum of Modern Art, New York, the Whitney Museum, the Seoul Mediacity Biennale in 2018, the 16th Quadriennale di Roma, Flaherty New York City, Haus für elektronische Künste Basel, ICA Milano, and now here at the 59th Venice Biennale. Giardina Papa received an MFA from RISD, and she's currently pursuing a PhD in film, media, and gender studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Giardina Papa is also a founding member of the artist collective Rada May, which also includes Ugandan artist Bachiba Okwenje and Indian artist Nupur Mathur. As a collective, these artists create performances and art installations that reveal forgotten archives, hidden histories, and peripheral sites, exploring their relation to gender, sexuality, and colonization. Please join me in welcoming Elisa Giardina Papa.
Can I put this a little bit up? Okay, thank you, Anya, for the introduction, and I'm happy to be here and to be in conversation with you, with Sophia, and with Saidia. And actually, I'm really honored to be part of this panel and to have a chance to discuss Saidia's notion of fabulation, because Saidia's work was a precious guide for me while I was working through the archival research that informs Us Canto a Disorderly Tale, which is a video and ceramic installation that I presented at the Milk of Dreams. And the archive I work with, or better, that I work with and against, as Saidia taught me while reading her, is the Sicilian and Mediterranean archive of the mythology and the history of the Donne di Fora. Donna di Fora can be loosely translated as the women from the outside, but also the women beside themselves. So the Donna di Fora were said to be both criminal and magical. They were said to possess both the feminine and the masculine, the human and the animal, the benevolent and the vengeful. And it is because of this improper affiliation that I wanted to produce a work about the Donna di Fora. For me, the Donna di Fora trouble hierarchies of being, the firm ways of being that fail to resolve into normative or prescribed feminine forms. I see them as queer, as magical, as criminal. And also the Donna di Fora were both imaginary figures, so figures coming from the imagination, and also determined historical people, healers, and medichesse, or mahare, as we will say in Sicilian, who live within the Sicilian community. To trace the mythology and the history of the Donna di Fora, I had to work two completely different archives, which at one point valiantly collided to become one, or better, one archive was inscripted in the other. And the first archive belongs to the Sicilian Mediterranean oral culture. So it is an archive of tales, of songs, healing rituals that were orally transmitted from one generation to the next for centuries. So a socio-poetic and socio-magical unwritten archive of the subaltern, the dispossessed, the multitude. The second archive is an archive of heresy, an archive constituted by Inquisition trials perpetuated during the Spanish domination of Sicily in the 15th, 16th century. So it is an archive of confession, often obtained under torture, an archive of fabricated accusation, of arrest, confinement, punishment, an archive of violated bodies and soul, an archive of shame and death sentences. As I was saying, these two archives at one point became one. That is, the socio-poetic and written archive of the multitude was surrendered to the inquisitorial discourse of heresy, perversity, and madness. That is, the tale of the Donna di Fara were used or became an instrument to persecute unruly, political, troublesome women who were also often punished for not being devoted to a normative or proprietary notion of selfhood and sexuality. For example, they were gay and they were unmarried. And yet it is mainly through the archive of the Inquisition that I found the names, the biographical traces, the spells and the healing rituals, and the wonder of the lives of the Donna di Fora, of women that believed themselves to be Donna di Fora or who were believed to be Donne di Fora. So while working through the inquisitorial archive, I had to ask myself how to rescue the wonder of those lives, right from the inquisitorial discourse, and how to rescribe those lives in the unwritten socio-poetic archive of the multitude. And actually, that was even possible for me, right? And so while working through this question, the work of Sadia, of course, and the notion of critical fabulation was a most precious guide, as it was also the work of Ariel Azoulay and the notion of potential history, the work of Munoz on the no longer conscious, and also the work of Jack Halberstam on the wild things and the disorder of desire. Even if, of course, I'm aware that a critical reflection, a theoretical reflection, and also methodologies that is developed within, in confrontation with one archive cannot easily, and maybe sometimes should not easily travel to a different archive. Nonetheless, for me to reread those texts was really important while I was doing this project. Okay, so how did I craft my counter and disorderly tale of the Donna di Fara? First, I reimagined the Donna di Fara as a gang of teenagers, tuners, who ride through the utopian city of Gibellina Nuova in Sicily. They ride on bikes customized with super loud car sound systems. And I reimagined them as a street culture music ensemble, which was on the move, and their movements created this disruptive tune that was traversing the utopian abandoned architecture of Gibellina Nuova. Gibellina Nuova is a small city in the hinterland of Sicily that was completely destroyed during the Belice earthquake in the 68. Then it was rebuilt as a utopian postmodern city, and then it was abandoned by its community. So there is a sense of failed promise in Gibellina. There is this strange conjunction of hope and defeat. And actually hope and defeat maybe was an affect I had to work through while I was working with the archive of the Inquisition. The disruptive tune of the bike tuners, that is a music, that is a tune that was originally composed by the Brooklyn composer Duendita, is also interwoven with words of a poem that my friend and brilliant poet from New York, Megan Fernandez, wrote based on the fragments that I collected from the Inquisitorial Archive. And the poem intersects the fictive and the historical. And that, to me, was not a problem at all, because I believe that the Inquisitorial Archive is already a fiction. First, because it is made of fabricated confession and acquisition. Second, because, as I was saying, it incorporated, it described in itself the socio-poetic unwritten archive of the multitude. And lastly, the subtitles of the poem, as you saw in these images, I'm playing here images of fragments of the film that is 12 minutes, so I cannot show it all, but some fragments I can. So the subtitles of the poem are in English, but the spoken word, the narrative voice of the film is in the Sicilian dialect. And that to me was actually quite important because it is my mother tongue, but also because it is a language that carries the traces of the many domination that we have witnessed throughout our history, and also unruly and beautiful communions. So it is a language that retains words from Arabic, Greek, Latin, Catalan, French, and Spanish, and now also carries the stigma of subalternity. So you can learn Sicilian from your mother or from your grandmother, but you can never use it to speak or to write in school. And also I wanted to use the Sicilian. I'm using the Sicilian for the title of the work, that is Us canto a disorderly tale. I'm using the Sicilian and the English, and I'm using some words also in the subtitles that we didn't want to translate into English because we thought that it was important also to pause a second and think about what cannot be translated from that archive, and also what cannot be translated from the stories. So the Sicilian worked in this way. Okay, so really quickly, I see I have 20 seconds. But anyway, everything that I described until now is related to the first chapter of the film, that is take one, A Tea for Mother Milk. In the subsequent 2 chapters, I almost abandon words and I proceed mainly through a visual narration. So take one is a ritual, is a spell, and you saw some fragments of it at the beginning, and take 3 is a goat. Oops, sorry, I lost. Okay, let me go to take 3. Okay, is a goat. Is a goat who walks through a Baroque palace which was built towards the end of the time in which the Inquisition was operating in Sicily. And the Donna di Fora were often described to possess or to be incorporating in their bodies animal attributes, such as a goat feet or like a pigtail. So it made sense to me to have this goat traversing this palace, interested but also not interested at all in the history of the palace and the kind of like social and power relation that created the palace of nobility. And to conclude, because art is often a collective effort, from the credits of the film, here are all the names of the people who work with me on this project.
Thank you so much, Elisa, for that wonderful presentation. And I must urge you all to see Elisa's work as well in the exhibition, which is also amazing. Okay, so I thought maybe we could begin this discussion by addressing the concept of fabulation, which is, of course, the theme of the panel. And I wanted to ask you, Saidia, to speak a little bit more about your concept of critical fabulation and perhaps also how you came to sort of realize that you needed to turn to fabulation as a mode of research and writing.
Yes, I think that my embrace of fabulation was as the result of a certain intellectual frustration, feeling like I had reached the limit of what I could think through certain disciplinary practices, and so many of the protocols of scholarly research and the Western episteme made it actually impossible to engage or to represent the lives and experiences of those, you know, I was most concerned about. And so, I mean, I think of Fabulation, you know, as not simply like a literary tool or a creative mode of storytelling, but essentially as a practice of unworlding, you know, deformation and reformation, a way of decolonizing the episteme and trying to build other ways of knowing. But I came to that through frustration, through what my own intellectual training wouldn't allow me to think. And so I was at an impasse, and I was like, oh, how do I want to think about my practice, and how can I get out of the intellectual box that was created for me by the settlers and the masters and the Enlightenment men at their desk.
Good, thank you. Elisa, how about you? What is your sort of relationship to the notion of fabulation?
Is it? Okay, sì. This idea. Like, to me, as I said, it was, I read Sadia's work, Venus in Two Acts, and like, the other work while I was doing my PhD at Berkeley. And immediately, like, it spoke to me, and immediately I started to think about this project of the Donne di Fora that had been in my mind for a long time, but I really didn't know how to address, because I already did some research on the archive. And I kind of didn't want to work on the archive because of the violence incorporated in it, and also because I wasn't sure how really to like rescue what I wanted to be rescued from the archive. So for me, really, Fabulation is what Sadia taught me and like helped me thinking through. And then of course my archive is a different one. You worked on the Middle Passage. My archive is an archive of the Mediterranean, the Sicilian, and from the 15 and 16, 1700. But so that's my answer.
Thank you. How about you, Sophia? How do you think about fabulation in relation to your work?
Well, I think less about my artwork with the phrase and more about my work as a screenwriter, because I spend all my days searching for clues towards individuals who might be lost to history, and so Sadia's work is also very important to me in that sense, as a sort of raft through that conversation, which often gets a bit hairy in meetings with producers and networks, because there's also this sort of constant refrain of what audiences want, which is this kind of like backwards way of thinking about the production of the story or the retelling of history or the revising of history. And it's, so in that way I feel that the word fabulation is very strongly related to my everyday work.
Great. And I think all three of you in your work engage the question of how to find a language to say something that is really difficult to say, or maybe impossible to say, to represent the unrepresentable, perhaps. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about this struggle with sort of representation. Sadia, would you like to begin?
I mean, I think related to what Sophia said, and Elisa's opening description of her project. I mean, we know capitalism required the enclosure of common land, but there's a kind of an enclosure of thought and an enclosure of the possibility of representing life through these forms of narrative implotment and imposition. And so, just really thinking like, okay, how do you represent a life that's not in the structure of the Bildung, right? Because the Bildung is part of the imperial project. So I think really a lot of a way of working through that is understanding what the expected story arc is supposed to be, right? And there's a way that the very language of the subject is entangled with these modalities of emplotment. I mean, those who I write about, exist in a kind of category crisis of the subject and the object, the human and the not, and in a way that that becomes enabling, because what is then my fidelity to those, to those story arcs that are about man or the subject, capital S, or, the telos, or a certain kind of developmental narrative, and really thinking more and more about how to inhabit prose that pushes against those requirements of formula. I mean, other people have done this work, people like Sylvia Wynter, Aimé Césaire, de Silva, people who are thinking about reformation of form, decomposition, recomposition, and all of that is critical to actually enable the range of stories that all of us want to tell here, right? So partly it's the sense that that enclosure of thought makes impossible the representation, not only of certain kind of lives, but a way of kind of denaturalizing and defamiliarizing, the order in which we're living, to kind of denaturalize this worlding and understand the violence of its production. And so that's the way in which I would want to think about the poetics of fabulation as related to a political project, as a way of imagining radical transformation. I think in Venus into Wax, I say fabulation is a way of, performing abolition on the page. And I think that formally, that's where we have to do it too, right?
And Sophia, I was thinking in your film, Tiger Strike Red, some of the opening scenes that are very much about language and letters, right? So you want to kind of put pressure on language there, in the way that letters and language impose order and write a certain kind of story, right? So, and you've obviously set those scenes in the library or the archive. So do you want to speak a little bit more about the sort of struggle with language in your work?
Language is definitely a struggle for me, especially when just speaking in a thread from inside. But the film opens with a child asking, "Why do I have to speak in English, Mom?" And practicing various statements. I am loved, I am free, etc. And I'm speaking in English, I write in English, I write inside of these emplotments, literally with plot, and it is it has always felt, since I was a child and learning Arabic, and then feeling shut out of that also, and that becoming something that I know that a lot of people who share this sort of bicultural or many-cultured situations, but in particular with Arabic, in my experience, it wasn't until I left the place that I came from, went to Egypt, and then was able to begin to learn in a different way that wasn't, again, like an entrapment of like the way that family or society was regarding me as an outsider or as a child who is half other or half stranger, half ajnabi. I think those are the ways in which language in particular like feeds into my work. It's very intimate, it's very personal, but it also feels so central to everything because it's the only tool that I have, it feels.
Yeah. And Elisa, in your work, you locate power in disorder and perhaps the gaps in intelligible language and what can't quite be articulated. Do you want to say a few words about disorder and sort of the power of disorder?
The power of disorder for me in this project was, I guess, to not try to fill in like all the gaps. And that already creates disorder because it's already reordering like in a different way. When you leave the gaps, somebody else can like, put their understanding, their projection, their like reading into those gaps. And since this is a work that is, like I wrote a lot on the archival research, and I had the sensation that I wanted to say too much, I wanted to put too much. So for me it was like, that's why at the end I decided to call it a disorderly tale, because I had to step back and be like, no, like I need to, being able to leave those gaps there. I need to be able to use the Sicilian even if it's gonna sound like a mafia movie. I need to like leave something that is not completely clear, that is not transparent. So in that sense, to me, is like I thought through disorder in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Saidia, your work obviously deals primarily with language, and you two work across media. But in the works that you've presented at the Biennale, they are visual works primarily. So I wonder if you could all reflect on what the capacities and perhaps limitations are of different forms, like what can be expressed in language and what requires other forms of expression. Maybe, Sophia, would you like to begin? You work in writing and film and visual art.
Often, I guess I'll do my best, but the art practice that I feel very blessed to be able to have and to practice is a place where I can escape a lot of those things which I discussed briefly that are frustrating about language and frustrating about structures and frustrating about capitalism, and working inside of that and working inside of a machine, of a media machine that is very violent and having battles very regularly inside of that. And so the art practice allows me to visually explore things that I can't inside of a sort of traditional media format, and also to deconstruct the narrative structures that I use always. And so in that way, especially with sound design, for example, I think that that's a really important part of the work for me. This piece was done with Joe Namey, who's also an amazing artist. And yeah, I think sound is something that's incredibly, sound and music are very profoundly healing modes of communicating for me. Even though I'm not a musician, I would like to be.
Elisa, how about you? What form do you sort of, because I know obviously you're writing a PhD at the moment, so you're working in an academic form, but what are your thoughts about the capacities and limitations of the visual versus the written word, for example?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I divide my brain in two, like I use different. The other two languages that I try not to mix, because actually we had this conversation at lunch, and what I was saying to Saidia is like sometimes to do a PhD is risky for your art, because then you try to be, you're this like rigorous, like you're inside this like rigorous methodology, and then you start to try to become rigorous in your art, and art should not be rigorous. You just have to go with what, like the images that comes to mind. So, but then like, I don't know, this is one of the most cinematic, I would say, project that I did in the last years. Usually I work on like with 3D, with like abstraction. So this was quite figurative for me, it was like quite cinematic. And there I felt the lure and also the danger of like really the camera, because if the archive is a technology of power and capture, then the camera is the other one, right? So sometimes the more you represent people, the less is left of them, right? And so that was a struggle for me, because there was a part of me that wanted the images to be beautiful, but also like the lure of the beauty of light cinema just scared me a little bit.
Saida, do you have any thoughts about the differences between different media?
I do. I wanted to say something about Elisa. I mean, what I loved is the moment when the goat is in the great bourgeois edifice, and there's a shot of the portrait, but the goat seems to be returning the gaze. So for me, there was this, I was reading that as this kind of moment that's reflecting also on portraiture, on the history of art, on who exercises the gaze. So it seems that the openness of the text is that it lends itself to all these possibilities of reading. I mean, I think in the book, I hope that other modalities can be present. Like in Wayward Lives, I have this, chapter called Riot and Refrain, which I wanted to be like a sonic text of the riot and of revolt. There's a way I am involved in my own very pre-cinematic practice, which is actually trying to, this practice of ekphrasis, which is trying to use photos and some stilled image, but to tell a story of radical movement. So I would hope that there could be the recognition of these like multiple genres in the work, and I feel like the thing that I really want to mess up, destroy, fuck with, is the distinctiveness of genre and form. Recently, I had the chance to write a short screenplay for a film of Khalil Joseph's, and what was really nice in that project was actually getting to build a deep sonic text of Black life, and just the kind of the dimensionalities of that felt so liberating, because inside the enclosure, the kind of really privileged Black critical modality has been sonic production. So to really build that out, and I think I want to do more than that. I think you spoke of the importance of opacity, but really trying to confuse the reader as to what they are reading, and because there's a kind of a protocol of reading that attends the discreteness of form, and and challenging that is also about trying to challenge the implotment, right? Like, oh, do you know what to read for if you're not exactly sure of what it is you're reading?
Jumping in, diving in backwards into a text is something I fantasize about all the time.
If I may bring us back to Leonora Carrington and the topic of fabulation for a moment. So one of the striking things about her work is the way that she very deliberately uses myth. And some myths she invokes in order to deconstruct them or rewrite them, and others she creatively appropriates to create her own very unique cosmology. And she often suggests that there are suppressed narratives underneath the surface of the official ones. And I wonder what your relationship to the concept of myth is in your respective works. And Elisa, maybe you'd like to start, because your work here at the Biennale engages very directly with the myth of the Donne di Fora.
It does. I'm not using too much the word mythology, because it makes it grand. And so I try to, I still have to find the specific word I want to use, but for now I'm using this socio-poetic, socio-magical, unwritten archive of the dispossessed and the multitude. That's why I'm not using the word myth too much, because, but then, what is interesting for me there is this but it's typical of the oral telling that you can always retell the story. And also, so for me to do this work, it was a way to kind of reconnect to that. I mean, the story changes each time you say it, right? Each time you tell it. And so for me, reconnect with that and keep up with that, retelling the same story and changing the story each time that you tell it was what I guess I tried to do. But mythology is similar. I mean, of course, the myth changes all the time according to whom is writing it down. In my case, it's not written down. The only people who wrote them down were the Inquisition. And then, of course, ethnography and anthropology, but that is his own discourse with his own problematics. So, yeah.
Yeah. And Sophia, how about you?
Around myth?
Yeah.
I suppose that is directly related to Tiger Strike Red, in that the various mythological characters that appear in it, through the institution of the Victoria and Albert Museum where it was shot, are the intention of the film. When this opportunity came, I couldn't imagine entering that space, entering the myth also of the museum, all caps, without having kind of a big purple crayon and running all over the place with it, which is what we tried to do. The other big reference was the Spice Girls Wannabe video. But this sort of, storming of myth and then garbling it and mixing things up and getting also the story, problematizing the idea of facts and I suppose undoing this question constantly of what do we know, and so when I've been fascinated by mythology since I was a child. I think it's one of those things that grabs us into stories from a young age, and so I find those touchstones really exciting to tear down also. So, for example, in the film, there's a scene in which Aisha is fighting a mask of Moses, which was done by Michelangelo, and at the time they had mistranslated the word for halo in the Latin Bible to horns. So Moses used to be drawn with horns and depicted with horns, and I found that fantastically funny. And so these are the kinds of things that I think are, at least, they can be useful hooks to undo the things also.
Yeah. Saidia, do you have a relationship to myth in your work?
I mean, I think maybe more tragedies and working with other, extant story forms rather than myth. I think when I was in graduate school, I read Vladimir Prop's Morphology of the Folktale. So the Russian formalist is this kind of analysis of all the folklores and myths from around the world. And because of patriarchy, in most of those stories, females are marked as objects and actants rather than heroes and questers. So even in terms of the structure, there's, the social text there. I mean, you were also asking about, Carrington, and one of the things that I was really loving in the work was the taxonomical confusion or crisis. It's oh, is it a woman or is it a horse? But yet it's not sentimental. So in one story, I think it's Virginia Burr, falls in love with the handsome boar, and they have a slew of piglets, and the boar dies, and she roasts the piglet children and eats them. So it's not some great interspecial romance. It's this, it's this kind of entanglement and intimacy that still has its risk and dangers and doesn't easily, transcend violence. That element in the work that, is untidy and messy. It's like a tail that keeps appearing or something like that. So. And just the embrace of a kind of aggressivity and discomfort, I thought, I thought was enabling, and I I think like, oh yeah, why don't I just like do that in my work? So it was like, yeah, more aggression in there.
Yeah, I love that story, and it's, I mean, it's quite violent, like you said. She eats her own children, saves one.
As it's a love story.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But her partner dies halfway through the story, and it's an amazing story. And perhaps on the topic of violence, I can ask you, Sophia, because that was one of the things that struck me with your work, Tiger Strike Red, that there is quite a lot of violence in the film, and in some ways this violence becomes embodied by this object that seems to be at the center of the piece, right? This great wooden late 18th century object, Tipu's tiger, which I think was created as a kind of revenge fantasy of the colonized subject, but then was sort of appropriated by, or it ends up in the Victoria and Albert Museum as a kind of curiosity, I suppose, but also the original violence becomes appropriated for a kind of British colonial masochism, like you mentioned, the British Vice, right, where this kind of desire for punishment. And then, of course, the end of the film that we saw, this beautiful but quite violent sword dance, which seems to be a kind of revenge on the museum itself and the violence wrought by history. So do you want to speak a little bit about the violent imagery in your work?
It's funny, when you were describing the object at the center of it, I thought that you were going to say the television, which is very much, I mean, before I go into that, the Tipu's tiger, the really fascinating thing that ended up becoming an extra layer within the sound design was that originally we wanted to be able to have something composed and played on it, but it's very fragile. And so there was a recording, and the recording was of Rule Britannia and also the Marseillaise randomly. So we used that throughout and warped it in a variety of ways. Fatma al-Khadiri made several tracks for the piece using that. And that really just under the belt kind of violence is also, the symbolic violence of that is something that I find really even more disturbing than some of the other things which I wanted to bring in on the television, because they're also a part of the archive, even though they aren't. It's like the lesser sort of the uncanonized and the non-capital trash sort of things that pass our screens, including something in there that I wrote, which is Yumna Marwan performing the Marseillaise in Little Birds, which was in itself like a taking of this cinematic moment that in every single movie book ever is like, Casablanca is the #2 greatest movie, these very like American textbooks. And so it was a reimagining of that, where the Marseillaise is not a song of like freedom, but is one to spit back in the face of the resident general. And so, again, that was like a scene that was very, had a very violent sentiment to it. But then placing all of it inside of that space felt like another little incursion, and hopefully undoing.
Okay, so Saidia, in Venus in 2 acts, you reflect beautifully on the role and capacity or incapacity of art and literature to heal the traumas of the past. If I may quote you, you write, "Is narration its own gift and its own end? That is all that is realizable when overcoming the past and redeeming the dead are not. And what do stories afford anyway? A way of living in the world in the aftermath of catastrophe and devastation, a home in the world for the mutilated and violated self. For whom? For us or for them?" So here you highlight the stakes of your concept, critical fabulation, that they are firmly located in sort of an ethics of the present. So I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit about, on how your concept of critical fabulation is linked to the present moment.
I think I don't know that I would even say that I'm involved in writing something as like a history of the present now, because I'm even more indifferent to history than I was before. But I mean, certainly there's the notion that we're inhabiting a world built by the structure of early modernity. So, so that's the way in which my archival encounters or intervention is, we're still trying to defeat the ledger, even if it's, the ledger created by surveillance capitalism in concert with racial capitalism. So there's not that sense of a discrete past for me. By writing those lines that you read, I feel like in the work I'm trying to walk this line, understanding what certain kind of practices ideally would make possible, which is a tool for inhabiting, this brutal place named world, but also really dealing with the kind of the insufficiency of art practice. And so wanting to acknowledge what a narrative can do, and yet what it fails to do. So I think that work of reimagining and transformation, the making that's afforded by poetics is really critical, and that's in tandem to like unworlding, undoing, and I think that in art practice we create other kind of critical vocabularies that can circulate and ideally, enable and stoke that imagination, but I certainly don't have the hubris which would enable me to imagine that is itself, undoing or unworlding.
Elisa, you decided in your work to transpose the story of 17th century Donne di Fora to the present moment in this postmodern sort of architecture. So your work also sort of deals with a tension between the present and the past, I think. Would you like to speak a little bit more about that?
While I went to Palermo and I was reading about the archive of the Inquisition, I started to look at this document, and then I went to Gibellina. And Gibellina, as I was saying before, is this particular place that was destroyed by an earthquake, then rebuilt as this utopian city in the center of Italy, as a postmodern utopian Sicily, and I'm not even sure that Sicily had modernity, so to have postmodernity was a little bit too much, and so the community then abandoned it, as you maybe have to abandon like a utopia at one point. As I was saying, that there is this like strange conjunction of like hope and defeat. Like you see the glimmers of like the utopian thinking that wanted the city to become like that in the center of Sicily, a utopian city, but also it is like you see the crisis of it because like people couldn't relate to it, and now it's like depopulated, and that's why. To me, that became the perfect setting for it. At the same time, I was in Palermo at the time. I started to talk with this teenager who were like doing like bike tuning. There was this like bike tuning culture, and I spoke with them, and I was like, "Why are you doing that? What is it?" Blah, blah, blah. And they were like, "It doesn't matter. The loudest will win." And that to me, at one point, all makes sense. I was like, okay, it's going to be the loudest win, it's going to be punk, it's going to be the bikes, and I work with these teenagers to produce the bikes, it's going to be Gibellina, and it's going to be an archive of the 15th century. And that's why it's probably like a disorderly tale.
It's really, really effective. And Sophia, I think your work also engages the tension between the past and the present, right? With like the impact that the past still has in the present, with the sort of colonial discourses that still structure the museum and other things. Do you want to speak a little bit about this?
I suppose the one thing that I have to say around that is that indeed, like the ways in which, again, especially language and storytelling and narrativizing and these all of these things come to us in a line that is like still entangling us, and it feels to me like something that it's impossible to escape in a way without the tool of fabulation.
Maybe it's time to open up the discussion to the audience and see if there are any questions for our speakers from the people in the audience. I think there's a question over there.
Thank you all for this talk, by the way. All three of you talked about the role of the sonic and music in your work and also in world building and fabulation kind of as a process. And I was wondering if you perhaps wanted to talk, any one of you, a little bit more about the role of, the sonic or music in kind of world building or myth making in your practice, or just in general as kind of a practice, as an art form.
Who wants to go first? Sophia?
No, you go.
I don't think that I fully understood how desperately I needed sounds, hums, voices, music, until being in a pretty profound isolation for 4 months during the beginning of COVID. And at that point, I wasn't able to engage with anything visual. It was very intense. And through that, listening to guided meditations in particular was something that began reconnecting me to something which really is the origins of all of my creative work from a child, even like the ways in which having music on in the background would tickle the parts of my brain that would start to become the parts of my brain that I use now to do the work that I do and make films like this. So it really feels like the seed or the unstruck anahata sound at the beginning of the universe. It is the beginning of everything, I think, much more than the word.
Lisa, do you want to?
I mean, this project, particularly for the first part, the take one, the sound is super important because it is about the tuning of this disruptive sound that is going around. And for me also the metaphor of the tuning was the perfect one, because I do also see the donne di fora as these figures that are like tuning their bodies among different realms. They're women, but they're also animal. They decide to have a goat feet, they have a goat feet. They decide to have a pigtail, they have a pigtail. They want to fly, they fly. So it was like tuning of the music, a tuning of the body, and then tuning through Gibellina. And for the music, I worked with this amazing musician. She composed all the music. After I shot the images, I did the editing, I sent it to her, and we started to work. And she like wrote the score and the music on the images. And her name is Duendita, and she does everything, like soul, pop, electronic. She's from Brooklyn, and she's a genius. So it was such a it was wonderful to collaborate with her.
Sadia?
For me, in terms of imagining Black sociality and the earliest descriptions of that sociality, it's impossible to do that without taking account of the sonic, I mean, from Otaba Cugoano describing the shared language of the wholes as groans and cries, to Douglas describing the circle, you know, just really a number of people, Roy de Carava to Ellison, really in terms of thinking about something like the frequency of Black life, the sonic text is inseparable from that frequency, and it's the language of its articulation. I think also in terms of just, you know, practices of undoing the order of racial slavery, whether we think about you know, Haitian voodoo songs and the importance of those songs in a revolutionary practice, like they were this resource for a political imagination that was outside of the terms of the Enlightenment. In my own archive, there's this really lovely description of enslaved people gathering, thinking about freedom, and they spoke of singing songs across the Potomac, and enslaved people would utter a song on one side, and it would have its call and response on the other side, which again brings in mind, you know, Stan Douglas's really beautiful installation here, 1848, 2011, and this beautiful dialogue between DJs in London and Cairo. So that's what it seems that the sonic enables another possibility of language, and often possibilities that you don't even need to speak the same language to kind of like share this realm of affect and sensibility and connection. You know, I was telling a friend after seeing the Stan Douglas, I remember I was in a club in Ramallah and there was a young DJ who was playing, and I was like I could be in Brooklyn, like in the sounds in that club. It was just, it touched me so deeply, and there was something that was so shared in the sound text she produced.
Are there any more questions from the audience?
Oh.
Thank you very much for everything that you've done. There's a part of me that doesn't want to answer this or ask this question. And really it's about freedom and uncertainty. And in terms of fabulation, when is it a time or a moment in your life where you felt most free?
Was that a question for anyone in particular? All of you?
I think I've been struggling to find that feeling forever.
Sophia, sorry, didn't hear your answer.
I just said I've been struggling to find that feeling.
Still searching.
Yeah, I'm still searching to be what that word conjures for me.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. Do you have an answer?
It is a difficult question, and I agree with Sophia. It's like, keep searching for it. But, I mean, for sure, maybe one of the reasons why I'm practicing art, I mean, that is my way somehow to, I don't know, get lost in things. And it's difficult. It's a difficult word to use, so I don't want to say in which I feel free, but like, I do feel I can move like between things and thoughts, and so it's not about freedom, it's more about like the movement and the cruising, I guess, for me.
I mean, I think it's transient, like we create these, I don't know, temporary autonomous zones that are fleeting. I also feel that, I guess, process and movement, sometimes the only times historically, collectively, Black folks have felt free is, in flight, I think that just the whole project of Black freedom, the as yet unrealized project of Black freedom, it's an exercise of fabulation. I mean, why did people ever think that it might be possible to be free in this order when nothing about the kind of the ruling episteme thought of that as, reasonable or as possible? And, freedom is one of these words that's part of, this very inheritance that I'm critical of, right? But it's so deeply inside me because of a long history of Black aspiration and longing. It's the language my grandmother, my great-grandma, so what it's not the freedom of the Western liberal contract. It's not the freedom of, the liberal subject. I think it's a freedom that has as its, goal something that, Denise Ferreira de Silva describes as, we can talk about the terms of another social order after the return of all the value of stolen life and stolen land. So in that sense, it's, it's unwieldy, it's aspirational, it's, after 400 years in this place, we're still imagining it and we're still dreaming about it. That's fabulation.
I think we still have time for one or two more questions, if there are any more questions in the audience.
Hi. It's very refreshing to see a panel of women in Italy, because I must say it's still a sexist country, but you talk a lot about undoing and deconstruct, and I sort of came to the realization that you cannot do that without accepting and welcoming vulnerability. So I wondered, if there was a particular time that you chose vulnerability and what you got out of it. Yeah.
Good question. Who wants to go first?
I can try. Thanks for the question. I think the act of sharing things, period, and art making is a very vulnerable thing. But I think one of the most, I think to go back to that question, I guess, of freedom, this word, I think that there's something about being radically open for me and learning to be vulnerable, which is a personal process, but it's also very much the thing that allows me to write or make work. So continuing to excavate that and hold that openness, and also to I suppose the abolition of the self, the things that killing the cop in your head, all of these very important works that all of us have to do constantly. It's like a life of becoming more vulnerable, I hope.
Quickly, I'm keeping deflecting this question to the work. And but in my work, I think vulnerability is what I was trying to say before with the question on order and disorder. Leave space and leave space to be misunderstood. Because sometimes when I do a work, I want it to say what I want to say. And then I always find myself to try to step back and be no, it can be misunderstood. You need to leave space for something to take direction and to be interpreted, imagining in a almost not completely different way, but in a different way that you wanted at the beginning. So yeah, so I'm answering vulnerability in relation to the work.
I did.
I feel that I am very precarious and vulnerable in the world, and I think that if my my fantasy of being in the world is like that figure in your film, Sophia, dancing beautifully with my sword, fighting off all the forces that be. So I think that the work requires one to be, vulnerable. But for me, that's actually different from the text of the social, where there's such a demand upon my labor, where there's a kind of precariousness that is inescapable. There's a kind of, so I think in that sense, I want another suit of armor, but the work is a different kind of place to inhabit, to be open, to be vulnerable to being affected by the force of, spirits or ancestors or goats or horses or that. But it's about the space of the work, right? I think that probably in thinking transformation in the world, probably refusal is a more important word for me than vulnerability.
I don't see any more hands, and it's a minute, I think, past 7. So I think it's time to thank our wonderful speakers for being here and having this conversation.